give you a couple of general information beforehand. The session will be recorded, and a couple of general information. It is helpful if you turn off your microphone. It might also be useful if you turn off your camera, because you might not appear in the recording. And for the end, after this talk, it roughly goes for 20 to 30 minutes. There'll be a question and answer session, and you can raise your hands and we go through the questions later on. If you like, take some information or make some notes from George's talk, and I'm sure there will be a lively debate later on. So this event is a Creatures event, and today we are presenting the research group Making Matters. Making Matters is a research group that concerns itself with practice, of course. As it says in the title, it's making, and its processes, but also the theory of creating the art. It is a mainly staff members group. They come from a diverse group, discipline background. They are multi-discipline orientated, some members in there as well. The making comes from different ranges and it uses different materials. The main aim so far is for this research group, Making Matters, to document research as a part of thinking through making. Today's event is a prelude to an exhibition we have later on, but I come to that at the end of the talk. For now, I would like to, and it is my pleasure, to welcome George Faraday. George is an associated professor at London Met, and he already has a long biography, but I'm going to give you a short condensed version because you possibly already have read it. So he studied at the Royal College. He then worked for Fosters and Partners. He is mainly interested in research of material, and that was his main purpose there. He worked with the University of Cambridge in the Center of Natural Material Innovation. And then he taught in this country at Queen Mary University, and he also taught in Belgium in the Institute of Design Center. And George's main interests are most likely material, but also natural material and the innovation of materials in the built environment. And particularly he is concerned of the creation of materials that could be generated again and again. So he looks in old processes and techniques. He is concerned about the environment, how timber can be grown here in this country, and generally the making and processes of these elements fusing together in a new project he just started, and that goes under the title Homegrown Houses. I think today we're seeing a kind of case study. He has invited a couple of collaborative friends, and I'm pretty sure George is much better organized for this event. So I hand you over to George. George, thank you for this presentation, and go ahead.
Thank you, Simone. Thanks for the introduction. Yeah, so first off, thanks everyone for attending, especially on such a lovely evening. It's lovely and sunny outside, so you probably don't want to be glued to your screen, so I appreciate your time, and I look forward to a lively conversation later, hopefully. As Simone says, I'm going to present now some work that's been ongoing for a few years now, and revolves around the use of one particular tree species, so sweet chestnut and coppice sweet chestnut specifically. The work I'm going to show you is, I suppose, a delve into the way that a kind of holistic approach with design can connect, a sustainable built environment with a kind of promotion of a sustainable local economies. If you have any questions, as Simone says, maybe we can get onto those after the brief presentation. So is that sharing okay for you, Simone?
Yes,
yeah.
Looks good. Thank you.
So I've called the talk Material Origins because I suppose the start of this work was really going back to the source of timber, so looking at in detail at forestry and particularly regional forestry in the southeast of England, which is where there's most kind of regional abundance of this coppice sweet chestnut material, which you can see in the background of this image. And I suppose the starting point for this research was quite holistic in its intent. So we were looking to use this notion of regenerative design as a catalyst to sort of try and create a new market for this underused timber. So sweet chestnut coppice has fantastic kind of mechanical and durable properties, but hasn't really found its way into construction in this country. There are some exceptions to that in Europe, but in the UK context, it's not really being used in construction. So we were looking at this issue, across a range of scales, I suppose. Firstly, primarily at the local scale, so looking at how this process of coppicing, which is kind of cutting the timber back, I'll show some images of this later, back to the ground on a kind of cyclical harvest cycle of sort of 15 to 20 years, how that process can have multiple benefits, not only for natural ecological systems, but also for human systems and a sustainable economy. And I suppose some of these subjects overlap, the local, the regional and the national kind of scale. So, we're also interested in this research in, this notion of kind of circular use of timber, so design for manufacture and assembly, but also for disassembly of building components. And we're also really interested in, the way that we can store carbon, capture carbon in terms of the coppice forestry, but then store it long term in building structures that are going to last, a long time. The third kind of prong to this, I suppose, is linking this to kind of some national issues around, the housing crisis, a healthy built environment, and I suppose a more prevalent use of sort of locally sourced natural materials wherever possible to replace kind of higher embodied energy, higher embodied carbon, imported alternatives. And I suppose, another kind of national backdrop would be things like the amenity uses of woodland, which I'll come on to in a moment. So that's the kind of context, that's the groundwork, the grounding for this work. And for those who aren't familiar with coppicing as a kind of method of forestry, this is a typical scene of coppice management. So what you'll notice in the background are these kind of slender, tall stems. So the process of forestry encourages the tree to grow these kind of straight lengths of timber when it's processed. And you'll notice also, I suppose, in the middle and the foreground, a range of other kind of flora prevalent on the kind of woodland floor. So by cyclically opening up the woodland floor to sunlight on these kind of 15 to 20 year harvest cycles, you get an explosion of kind of biodiversity as a result of that light, effectively. So it's a kind of a biodiversity net gain way of harvesting timber. And this process happens in sort of peri-urban woodlands on the fringes of London, but also further afield across kind of Sussex, Kent, and the southwest as well, primarily. The other thing to note about coppice is that it's a process of woodland management that's associated with ancient woodland as well. So we've been coppicing timber, pretty much since the Romans in Britain, and it's been a continuous process ever since. The only thing that's really changed are the markets for timber. So originally, the economic use would have been for fuel, for coke, for making for sort of forging iron and things. And more recently, markets have included things like hop poles for growing hops for the brewing industry, and also exterior fencing applications. So there's lots of interesting relationships between the uses of timber and the benefits that this coppice process can bring to natural ecological systems. And there have been various studies on this over the years. So I'm just going to show some images from a couple of papers on the abundance of or the increase in bird life here on the left, relative to the age of a coppice stand in the woods. So you'll notice there's a spike in bird numbers around sort of 6 or 7 years through that coppicing cycle. And this is the relative height of coppice you can expect over those similar sort of time frames in meters there on the x-axis of that graph. So it's biodiversity net gain, and it's flora and fauna that are encouraged into these woodlands. And of course, coppicing also opens up woodlands for amenity uses for us as humans as well, so that we can all as a society enjoy walks in the woods because it's being managed and it's accessible. I suppose a wider sort of global context, I was always interested in this statistic that the UK is the kind of second largest net importer of forest products, second only to China. So that gives you a sense of just how much timber and wood-based products we're importing into the UK, compared to other parts of the world. And I suppose as a direct result of that statistic, that high level of importation, rates of woodland management in the UK are pretty low at about 59%. So approximately 40% of our woods are basically overgrown and unmanaged. And the problem with that is that it encourages much higher prevalence of sort of disease and pests, particularly in association with things like global warming in these unmanaged woods. So by managing through coppicing, we can improve both the health of our woodlands, open them up for amenity uses and biodiversity, and harvest a locally sourced timber effectively. And the reason, I suppose, for honing in on one species in particular in the sweet chestnut tree was really, I suppose, to do with regional abundance. So this map probably appears relatively small on your screen, so apologies if you can't make out the colour gradients here. But what this is showing is that sweet chestnut is kind of most prevalent in the kind of southeast or the southern England context. And as a result of that, unsurprisingly, it's also that the home county is also home to the highest density of kind of coppice workforce, which is an aging population of workers, skilled forestry practitioners and cleavers of timber who we need to find new markets for, so that we can kind of encourage the next generation of coppice workers into the industry. The other reason for looking at the southeast for this research was related to the built environment. So London and the southeast are home to the highest number of kind of new start building projects in the UK. So there's a lot of construction waste associated with that number of projects, and as a result, we kind of felt as a group of collaborators that it was quite important to encourage more local use of and local sourcing of particularly natural materials in and around London and the southeast. So the next few images I'm going to show are some slides from posters that the Woodland Trust have put together. So some of you may have seen these sorts of images and statistics before, but for those who haven't, just to explain the current state of things, you'll notice here in the kind of graph in the middle that there's been a huge kind of exponential spike in pests and diseases in woodland ecosystems over the last sort of 20 or so years, linked primarily to climate change, I understand, but also to this drop off in kind of woodland management that I mentioned before. Compounded by that, you'll see there's also a kind of equally steep decline in biodiversity in our woodlands since the 1970s. It's about 30% drop since 1970 on woodland birds, for example. And only 7% of our native woodlands are in what is termed a good kind of ecological condition. So there are lots of reasons for us to be encouraging greater management.
George, sorry, we lost your sound.
I'm sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Great. Don't know.
It seems like you're muted again.
Okay, hopefully, I'm not sure why that's muting, but hopefully that doesn't continue. Let's see. Did you hear the last slide? Okay.
Let's maybe repeat the last sentence you said.
Okay, sorry. I think my finger must have slipped there. Apologies. Yeah, I was just sort of explaining there that native woodlands are there's only sort of 7% that are in what are called a good kind of ecological condition. And we all know the benefits, I suppose, of encouraging the health of woodlands and trees in general. So, they sequester huge volumes of carbon. Urban trees in particular are brilliant for kind of water management, pollution control and temperature regulation in our towns and cities. And they're fantastic. As we saw in the COVID pandemic, access to woodlands and green space was incredibly important for the kind of mental well-being of everyone, really. So greater amenity access to woodland is also, I suppose, within our remit for this research, to encourage greater access to woodland spaces through use of timber. Linked to all of this, in terms of the carbon story, is the fact that the vast majority of hardwood that's grown in the UK is just burnt for biomass, which is it's a renewable source of energy, but it's releasing back a large volume of carbon into the atmosphere. So if we can find a cascade of functions for timber that we grow in the UK, burning it being the very last stage of that cascade of uses, if you like, that can only be a good thing. And I think the built environment is quite uniquely placed to kind of lock in carbon long term in through the use of timber in buildings, as everyone will know. So I suppose that was the preamble, if you like, to the introduction to the design work that we did in this Homegrown House project. It's kind of been running as through a couple of phases. So the Homegrown House being the first phase, and I'll show you some images of the second phase, which is the Homegrown Cabin project, which is related. But Homegrown House started as a regional focus, as I've mentioned, but also kind of a nod to the split kind of north and south, if you like, between coniferous species of trees that are grown primarily in Scotland and the abundance of broadleaf hardwoods that are grown primarily in the south of England. And we were keen to choose a location relatively close to London to kind of, I suppose, exaggerate the fact or highlight the fact that there is a regional abundance of sweet chestnut timber on London's doorstep. The site we're working with at Badgells Woods on the Burling estate is about an hour and a half's drive from where our university is located. And this is what the estate looks like. So in the background, it's quite similar to that previous image I showed of Coppicing. Here in the background, you can see a stand of trees that's about 35 years in age. And then in the middle ground there, you can see some regrowth of coppice that after about 6 to 12 months of harvesting. And then in the foreground, you can see these coppice stalls that have been cut right back to the ground, and all of the timber's been kind of cleared from the site and is ready at roadside for processing into dimensional timber for use primarily in fencing, as I mentioned. So we were keen to see, how quickly these sorts of sites can regenerate, but also to try and find uses for this mixture of kind of small, medium and large diameter coppice trees that are being harvested from woodlands like this in the southeast and in Kent in particular. So I suppose I kind of jump from the forestry there to, if you like, the outcome of that first phase of research. So this is actually an exhibition catalogue that just shows 5 building prototype systems that we developed from small, medium and large diameter coppiced timber for use in construction. So we were using as few cuts as possible to make sure it was most likely to be economic. We were using processing techniques with things like mobile sawmills that you could replicate elsewhere in the country. So using tools that were available in and around the UK, readily available processing systems, and a focus on simplicity of joints and structures as well. So we're collaborating with a structural engineer who was testing these building systems at the one-to-one scale using computer modelling as well as some physical prototyping that you can see in the photographs here. And all of this was exhibited in that woodland setting to kind of, I suppose, exaggerate and communicate the links between sustainable woodland management and the equipment that's used to do that, and this notion of kind of regenerative ecological design with coppice. And this fed into some kind of public outreach articles and events that where we try to influence thinking and the timber supply chain by sort of advertising what we were doing in things like the Timber Trades Journal here, but also showcasing the work at COP26 to share our findings with the wider audience and engage people in a conversation about coppice and where it comes from and what you can use the material for. I think one of the most important aspects of coppicing for me and most of the questions that I kind of took at the stand at COP26 was around the real ecological credentials of coppicing, because it can look quite stark, the fact that there's a cleared acre here of trees. So the image at the top shows the site that our material came from just after harvesting, but the image below is the regrowth of those trees, those coppice sweet chestnut trees, after only 5 months. So though those regrowth stands are kind of above kind of average head height after 5 months, so it's an incredibly vigorous plant and tree species, and really does sequester carbon quickly as a juvenile kind of tree, and regrowth is exponential, really. This image takes me to the second phase of the project, which is called the Homegrown Cabin project. So related to, I suppose, the work that you saw before in that exhibition catalogue, but this project was funded by the Forestry Commission to, I suppose, take that development work in the first phase to the next stage, and to detail and build a construction system primarily using coppice sweet chestnut timber. So the ambition with this was to demonstrate that the building systems and the regenerative design thinking we developed in the first phase could be scaled effectively, and could in the future be scaled again to have an impact in terms of the built environment and things like the housing crisis in the southeast. So this image shows a fragment of a cabin construction, and it's trying to showcase all of the brilliant properties of sweet chestnut to the max, really. So using it cleft as an exterior rain screen, so making use of its natural durability as a timber, but also using it structurally in the form of the first structural insulating panels with coppice sweet chestnut timber, which you can see in some of the kind of peel away there of the layers of the cabin. And this related to statistics on in terms of woodland management with coppice sweet chestnut. So in the UK, we grow about 19,000 hectares of coppice sweet chestnut, and if you were to use that coppice resource only for the production of housing, that would generate about 83 homes per day. So you could grow effectively 83 homes per day, or 30,000 homes per year in perpetuity, because it's coppiced on a kind of rotational basis. So that for me was quite a kind of stark statistic. Obviously it's not entirely representative, because the vast majority of that timber at the moment is used for things like fencing and other applications. But to put things in context, these were some quite helpful numbers to kind of speculate about, and I think really drives home the fact that this material really does have a home, and really can have a big impact on the built environment if we can specify it in the right ways. And it's only one of a whole host of timber species, or tree species I should say, that are grown in the UK that have other sorts of properties that I'm sure could find their way into the built environment as well. So it's kind of one slither of what we grow, but it can have quite a significant impact on fixing social systems in a regenerative way, as well as ecological systems in a regenerative way through the way that it's harvested. So in this cabin project, you know, we've also tried to work in a holistic way with the local infrastructure, if you like. So on the estate that we're working on, there is a static sawmill, and we're trying to encourage greater use of this sawmill through the kind of kit of parts that we've developed from the coppice sweet chestnut poles that you can see in this image. So these photographs show the simple kind of cutting processes we use to convert these straight poles into structural beams that we used in our structural insulated panels. So effectively cutting the log in half down its length, inverting those planks of timber, and creating a kind of a space with a kind of a web of sweet chestnut to separate those outer skins of timber and create a stiff structural member. And these beams effectively were used to create these simple equilateral A-frames, which we've most recently been using as a building system to stack in series to create a kind of repeatable structural bay, which you could scale, you know, as far as you wanted for different scales of buildings. So this shows one of the A-frames on its side, and this is work that's literally been happening this week, so it's sort of fresh hot off the press. And some photographs from the site today, actually, of the prototype cabin segments being stacked in series, and to really test this as a system and see where improvements can be made, and to act as a focal point for, you know, debate and conversation, to invite architects and engineers and policymakers down to discuss, you know, locally sourced timber and what it can do for the built environment and the kind of local ecology in this setting. So I'll show you now a very quick time lapse of the construction, just to kind of explain the building process in a bit more detail. It's essentially a repeatable system that stacks in series, and will later this week and next be overclad with that cleft chestnut rain screen that you saw in the rendered image. So in summary, I think this has been a really interesting process of research and collaboration to go through for me personally. And I think if I go back to that first slide I showed about the kind of project intentions with, you know, promoting this idea of regeneration, not only of natural systems, but also of human systems, through a process of coppicing of locally sourced timber. I think we've achieved some of our goals. You know, we've had some influence in terms of policy and funding from the likes of the Forestry Commission. We've folded some of this research into our architectural teaching at the university at London Met, and promoted some of this research and presented it to architects' practices as well to try and influence the built environment that way. And we've also created a network of you know, regional and local suppliers for these natural materials, and tried to tap into you know, this notion of a local sustainable economy to improve, you know, society in that sense as well. I'll finish here with a QR code. If you have your mobiles to hand, if you want to learn more about the project, that will take you to the project web page. And a couple of acknowledgements here. The funding for the Homegrown Cabin project was a Forestry Commission funded project through the Woods into Management Forestry Innovation Fund, and was in collaboration with Grown in Britain and the Burling Estate, Mule, who are structural engineers and architectural designers, and London Timber Frame and Nick Meach, who are a pair of seasoned carpenters. So thank you very much for your attention, and hopefully we can open up the session now to a kind of fairly informal conversation around some of the issues that I've talked about.
Thank you, George. That was really a really deep insight into your project. It was really interesting to see in terms of scale, how fast these woodlands can regrow and what you can build with them. So I would like to remind everyone, if you have a question, please raise your hand at the top bar. And I wonder if anyone is already ready to have a question. Can I just maybe kick off this then, George? There's a lot of regenerative design, and how can you make the connection to the environment on a wider scale than just people who are already interested in timber? So one was obviously going to the COP 26, but do you see other possibilities where to promote your project?
I think the most effective tool of all was probably that Woodland Exhibition, I think. So that was a suggestion from Nick and one of our collaborators, and I think showing development work in the context in which the material has been grown was quite a powerful communicative tool. And I think although we didn't have a huge audience come and see the work in that setting, I think those that did come, left with a much stronger idea of the potential for sort of regenerative design, I think. So I'm an advocate for seeing things in the flesh, and I suppose going back to what you were saying at the very start, Simone, about materials and making, that's very much the way I was taught, and I think showing materials in their natural context in with regards to timber has quite a powerful effect to change people's minds, I think, and open eyes. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I see your fellow partners in the project are already on air.
Yes. Yeah, perhaps I can introduce them. So we're joined by two of the collaborators I highlighted on the last slide there. So we've got Dougal Driver, who represents Grown in Britain, who run a sustainable certification scheme, amongst other things, and influence policy at kind of governmental level on local sourcing of timber, and Guy Neville, who owns and runs the Burling Estate, where all of that timber was harvested, and where the mill is located, and where the site is for the cabin. So thank you for joining us, guys.
I wonder if any one of you has something to contribute to George's presentation.
Forgive me, Guy, if I just go first. Thanks, Simone. I'd like to add, I'm sorry I wasn't able to join straight away, technical issues, but so if I repeat something, I apologize. But I'd also add to the reason why this is so important is that we delegate our responsibilities for sourcing sustainable forest-based materials largely to other parts of the world. George indicated the percentages, but I use the phrase delegating our responsibility. It's sloping shoulders, really. I was speaking recently to somebody who does a similar job to me, but in Australia, and we're not unique. He was saying similar things for Australia. And I think the whole world needs to look a little bit closer to home for sustainable materials for whatever use. And the other point I would make is around added value. We as a country tend to import finished, more processed materials, so it's almost a double negative, because not only do we make the most of our woods, we don't, as George pointed out, in terms of under management. But when we do import, we import higher value as well. So none of the real value is kept in it, whether it's academic, whether it's scientific, whether it's labor, whether it's GDP, whether it's sustainability. It's not kept here. So it's really important, therefore, that people like George, places like LMU, do really invest in adding that ultimate value to a piece of growing fibre, because it in its final, to go from a piece of growing fibre on an estate like Guy's to something that is fit for purpose for people to live in, adds the ultimate value. And at the moment, we largely import that value.
Hi, Guy.
Hi. Yeah, there's not a huge amount to add, because I think George did a fantastic job in covering it all. Probably a couple of things I'd like to say there. One is, the reason why we got involved in the first place was, at the moment we've got quite a reasonable area of sweet chestnut coppice, and there's about 250 acres of it, and we're probably having about 4 acres a year harvested normally for fencing, and that's it. And the other sort of main market, as George alluded to, is biomass. And I've just felt, whilst in theory it's renewable, at the moment what we don't need is a massive great slug of carbon being sent into the atmosphere. It's going to take it is renewable because it takes, the trees reabsorb it, but they take 20 to 30 years, if you're talking about coppice, to do that. And now is not the time. Once we get ourselves into a situation where that cycle works a bit better and we've got the time, then I think that's probably a reasonable way to go about it. So I was very keen to try and see, I have been very keen to try and see what else we could do with it. So it was very exciting to get involved in this and try and see if we can generate another market, because at the moment the fencing market is not drawing enough of that sweet chestnut through. And the only alternative otherwise is biomass, which doesn't seem like a very good way to do it. I think the other thing that's brilliant about this, it's a very, I think because of the size of the timber and not necessarily processing it into fully dimensioned sections, it has a real sort of tactile quality to it. And I think that that helps to engage you with the material. And I think that the engagement is a really, really important thing here. I think engaging people with woodlands so that they come to understand them and they come to love them and they come to appreciate them. We're in a moment of climate emergency and biodiversity loss. The one thing we really need is everybody to really care about woodlands and nature. And it seems like a very nice way to be able to do that. It's a very accessible way to do that. And I think for us, we run a campsite in the woods, and hopefully we'll get the cabin in to the woods, and then people will be able to sort of see that process all the way through from, a bit of coppice that's been cut through to a product at the end. And I think trying to make people aware of that will be fantastic. And going back to the biodiversity side, it's extraordinary when you cut the coppice. And that first year, you see all the butterflies moving back in. And then the woodland species, you get some that will only grow in the shade, and you get some that will only grow in the sun. So as soon as the coppice is cut, poof, up the ground flora pops and the butterflies move back in. And that's the thing that then starts to bring the rest of the wildlife. So the birds start to come in. So as George's slides, you get this sort of peak for a while where there's a different structure to the woodlands in terms of the plants that are there and the animals that are there. And so being able to coppice regularly with blocks that are sort of connected to each other, working their way through the woodland, means that you're drawing these creatures in and allowing them to remain within the woods. If it's unmanaged, the wood just grows and gets bigger and it gets darker and darker underneath, and actually you start to lose out as a result. So I think there's some, there are some fantastic things if we can start to scale this approach.
Can I ask, whether you introduce all this fantastic, and it is not over a long time span, growing and the possibility what you can do to a wider audience? I know that farms open up their places to families, and they have tours around at certain times in the year. Do you do any of this?
We do it through the campsite, yeah. So we get 6,000 or 7,000 people a year who come through there. And so we run lots of courses around sort of bushcraft and you know, craft, making spoons and things out of timber. And so I think in a way, again, that's another way of engaging people with it. So they're camping within the woods themselves rather than next door in a field. And so we do everything we can to try and sort of engage people with it as much as we can. And that we find that's probably the, you know, the best way that we can do it.
Mm-hmm. And what is your possibility to get politicians involved into this? Maybe George. First guy.
Well, I was going to say, I mean, we're interesting. We're about to go for a planning application to try and put some more cabins in to the woods. And so I think as a result, that's the sort of starting point to start to engage with the local authority. And then I think as we're able to, you know, use the prototype to demonstrate what that might look like, that's a very nice way to be able to showcase what's possible. And the fact that actually it's low impact in terms of a building that's being put into a piece of woodland, but has huge benefits that run alongside it. I think it's just getting their time, to be honest. I think if you can get them in the woods to come and see it, then they immediately become quite engaged with it. But it's that's the thing, it's getting their attention.
Yeah.
I
can add a little bit there, Simone, if you want, around I'm fortunate enough, I mean, Growing in Britain is not Marmite. We are a certification scheme here to support UK woods, trees and forests, and the timber's amazing. So we do have the pleasure of meeting a lot of politicians at the highest level. So I would say that the politicians at the highest level do not have any qualms with what we're trying to achieve. It's what a lot of the manifestos set out to do. Last time there was an election in the United Kingdom, and what we're doing is supporting that. And indeed, they do support us, as you can see. This is a public grant supporting this phase that George outlined. And I meet regularly with ministers, but to be honest, their passion is not that much different from mine, Guy's and George's when you meet them. But there's a huge gap between that and practical delivery of the kind of support mechanisms that you need to be able to make a scaled up difference. And without getting too political, it really is important that we do what we do, as you've seen tonight, but that also there are mechanisms by which you can scale that up. And that really is around processing, because I think George might have described the two carpenters as rather unique. We can't scale up to build those 30,000 houses, or even a fraction of those, by using unique, rather niche skills in a few people. That's just, you know, and so we've lost a lot of manufacturing over the years. So to actually find somebody to build things at scale might be tricky, even if we do prove many things at this scale. So I think the three of us on this call and the other collaborators in this project, under George's leadership, we're under no illusion that there's another scaled up phase of development before you can get to that point. And I think once you can demonstrate that this would affect jobs, economies at scale, then I think the politicians would possibly, hopefully, put their money where their mouth is, because we need support mechanisms for scaled up processing, quite frankly.
Yeah, that seems very evident.
It might be interesting to get, I know there's a couple of architects on the session as well. It might be interesting to get an architect's perspective on, you know, sourcing of locally sourced timber, and because I know things like grading is an issue for a lot of architects, and also this idea of kind of repeat specification of things. You know, if you're in a bigger practice, that's something that I experienced in practice, was you know hesitate to say cut and paste, but repeat specification of the same sorts of materials and systems, rather than looking to innovate or change the status quo. So I'd be interested to hear from architects in practice at the moment on that, if anyone's available.
Anyone?
Things might have changed since I worked at practice. They probably have, but.
Okay. I really think this is a good opportunity to ask George some questions.
There is a hand up. Sorry, Simone, to interrupt you, but there's a hand up.
See it. Marina, would you like to unmute and state your comments or questions?
Hi, yes. Hi, George. This was really fascinating. I decided I will jump in because I am also an architect. Not practicing currently in the traditional sense, but I ran a walking tour of public buildings that starts in Forest Hill at the Horniman Museum and Gardens. And there's a really lovely timber building there by Archetype. It's a timber building, which I think uses some principles of the self-build method by Walter Segal. And I found out somewhere that the lifespan of the building was estimated at 10 years, and it was completed in 1996, and it's still standing and doing really well. And I don't know that much about it, but I wonder how building regulations and material warranties come into building with timber, because I haven't been able to find out, but my suspicion is that the lifespan of the building was estimated for 10 years because of material warranties or possibly building regulation constraints.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure Dougal will have a view on this, but I also remember conversations with practices where, for things like warranty or for insurance purposes, that's often been a barrier to I suppose what would be called more groundbreaking use of timber and different species of timber in buildings. So I know there are some fundamental hurdles like that to get over.
It's a big debate. It's a very good question, actually, and quite frankly, you can get lost in a debate about building above certain heights. Grenfell has led to many restrictions on use of cladding and timber above certain heights, etc. And there's very you can understand why policymakers have reacted the way they have to disasters like that, and you can understand why insurers might be skeptical of timber when it's just not part of calculations that are known to them, and the cut and paste that you mentioned, George. However, there's a huge market to go for that isn't within these areas. There will be some architects who will push the boundaries with timber construction at height and at depth and at completeness. Growing in Britain has another project, which is where the client wants to go 100% almost. But actually, quite frankly, for reality, there's a huge amount to be obtained from going from what you might call the low-hanging fruit around using timber to replace concrete and steel. So yes, it's a very good point by Mariana. But sometimes showcase buildings in showcase cities are just that. And when you've got 30,000 homes and 18,000 hectares of fantastic material, that needs to probably be a bit more mainstream in its use.
I remember you, Dougal, talking about, I think, getting into even just things like the skirting board market or the timber flooring. I mean, that's a much bigger volume than structural timber, isn't it? It's just far greater, I suppose.
Yeah, and and maybe laminating bits together to form structural components. I mean, I don't wish to cut the passion. There's no one more passionate about British trees, woods and forests than me, but actually if you can sort of cut small bits of coppice into something that becomes a laminated beam and you sold that online per linear meter, I'd be very happy, because you'd sell a lot of it and it'd get a lot of coppice managed and it would put a smile on Guy's face, you know.
I think there's also a really valuable aspect of well-being, that if people live in these, not alone that they could go to the woods and see where they grow, but also live in these, that would help people living in a better environment rather than in concrete. So yes, it's possibly a question for architects to come to the fore. May I open the floor for more questions to any one of our guests? Okay, if we don't have any questions, I'm pretty sure that most of you have the possibility to put some of these questions to George. He also had shown at the end of this the QR code to get more information, and if you're really interested, there are possibilities to get in touch with George. Towards the end of this session, may I thank George very much for this presentation, and also his guests, Guy and Dougal. Thank you for coming in and bringing in valuable information. This is also the opportunity to say that we have an exhibition from the 5th of March, that's the private view, where we show research from members of staff of the Research Matters group, and George will present and hopefully have also, George, maybe a catalogue from this you mentioned in your presentation, and it will be a good opportunity for people to come around, have contact with George on the day or during the duration of the exhibition. The exhibition will go until the 13th of May. And it would be lovely to see as many of you coming and seeing his work and other people's work. And yeah, thank you very much, everyone, for turning up and seeing this presentation. And George, thank you very much for giving the presentation.
Thank you for chairing, Simone, as well, especially on such a nice evening. That's very kind of you.
It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure. Thank you, Guy and Dougal, for turning up as well and contributing.